But now we are moving on to our next session. So I'm going to turn it over to Tom Petzelaus, and we'll hear a little bit about what Gallup is going to be doing for the coalition.
Thank you, Keith. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. We're extremely fortunate to have with us the Executive Director of the Education Division of Gallup. And before I introduce her, let me say that this partnership with Gallup has been extremely valuable to the efforts of the coalition. First, as Rick mentioned yesterday, it was the Gallup Purdue survey results in 2015 that were the motivation for the beginning of this work. And secondly, the next connection with Gallup is the team at Gallup will develop and administer a survey instrument to assess our progress. And I'm very pleased to say we've just last week signed an agreement with them. And thirdly, I think that the partnership with Gallup is the answer to the question that Brian Olson brought up yesterday, which is when you try to go to scale, you necessarily decompose into a large number of individual efforts with very different approaches. And what can we do to tie them together as a concerted whole? And I think that the next section partly answers that question. The key is to allow the flexibility for each university to pursue these common goals of life transformative education in its own way. And I would offer that a possible answer to tying it all together is to have the common goal and a common assessment of progress towards that goal. And so that ties into this next presentation. The final value that Gallup brings is as an outside assessor with tremendous credibility. Our results, if they are positive and are successful, will be taken much more seriously by higher education and lead to what we'd like to see be a national movement with that credibility. So for all those reasons, I'm really excited about this increasing partnership with Gallup. And I want to thank again the Kern Foundation for their support, which is allowing us to make that partnership. So our speaker, let me tell you a little bit about her, and she'll tell you what is planned. She is Stephanie Markin. She's the Executive Director, as I mentioned, of Education Research at Gallup, and she's responsible for the strategic direction of Gallup's research at the K-12 and post-secondary levels. Stephanie served as the Chief Methodologist before she became Executive Director, Chief Methodologist for Gallup, and as such, she was responsible for the design methodology of the Gallup Purdue survey that we've all been referring to. So she knows it intimately, and you'll hear a brief summary of her unique perspective on that study. Prior to joining Gallup, she was at Westat, a research firm specializing in complex social science studies for the federal government, state agencies, and foundations. She received her bachelor's degree in political science from Elon University and her master's degree in survey research from the University of Connecticut, of which we are very proud. And these are two institutions where she points out she received life transformative education. No surprise, given her success in her career. Please welcome Stephanie Markin. Well,
thank you so much. Thank you all for having me. It's good to see some familiar faces and also meet some new friends and colleagues on this call. I'm excited to join you all and talk a little bit about the research that we've done historically at Gallup, and also, of course, importantly, the research that we'll do together. I'm going to go ahead and say those fateful words. I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if you can see that good PowerPoint. Yes, with big
nice and clear.
Wonderful. So the team asked me to put together just a few slides to really guide the discussion and just to get us started, but I'd love to hear your good questions. So please, as we're moving through the presentation today, please feel free to stop me. And then of course, I'll reserve some time at the end so we can discuss exactly how we'll partner together and answer your good questions about the nuts and bolts of that project. So I'm going to start us off and share just a little bit about the Gallup Purdue Index and Gallup Alumni Survey work that we've been conducting over the course of the last 8 years. Some of you may be more or less familiar with the work. This work has really a central premise, which is that a lot of the traditional measures of a college degree, and particularly if a college degree is valuable, are based on economic measures alone. People talk about employment status. Of course, it's important to be employed when you graduate. People talk about income level. Of course, graduates want to achieve a livable wage and a great income. But we often talk just solely about those two large economic indicators and miss out on some of the most important parts of a college degree, which of course are the extent to which it transforms your life, the extent to which you feel engaged and fulfilled in your work upon graduation, and the extent to which you feel like you're achieving what we call high well-being at Gallup. So about 8 years ago in 2013, we partnered with Purdue, and our intent was really this. We wanted a metric that individual universities could use to measure the extent to which they were delivering on students' expectations and really having their desired impact on college graduates from their institutions. So we created a core survey that we've been measuring annually ever since, called the Gallup Alumni Survey. And we've surveyed more than 100,000 graduates to date through that work who've achieved their bachelor's degree or higher. And we survey on a wide variety of metrics. We asked them a series of questions about their time while they were enrolled in college and a series of questions about their experiences when they graduated. The desire there is just to understand what experiences while enrolled best set students up for success upon graduation. And when we talk about success, we often talk about things like well-being and engagement and fulfillment in their work. But we also talk about things like time to a good job upon graduation, and also importantly, the extent to which you feel like your degree was worth the cost. Now, those of you who are more familiar with our work are probably also familiar with these 6 items that we've used since we really started the survey that we fondly call our Big 6. And these 6 items span issues of relationships that students have while they're enrolled, but also engaging learning experiences that they have while they're enrolled at the institution that do have a significant impact upon their experiences at graduation. The first 3 items that we use are actually here on this screen, and they really are designed to help understand the extent to which people had a professor who made them excited about learning, somebody who really engaged them in that classroom, the extent to which students felt cared for as a person, not just as a student in the classroom, and the extent to which they had a mentor who encouraged them to pursue their goals and dreams. We asked these graduates to rate the extent to which they agree with these statements on a 1 through 5 scale, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And you'll see here, this is the percentage of graduates nationally strongly agree with these statements. So you'll see the majority of students believe they had at least one professor who made them excited about learning. But I think slightly more concerning is just about a quarter of graduates nationally report that they had professors who cared about them as a person and a mentor who encouraged them to pursue their goals and dreams. 2 areas in which we know have a huge impact on their likelihood to land at a really fulfilling and engaging job upon graduation, but also importantly, that reflect really positively upon the institution. We find if students strongly agree with these statements, they're more likely to be donors to the institution upon graduation and more likely to be brand ambassadors of that institution. So it's important, not just because these are important, experiences for students to have for their own sake, but it's also good for the institution when they do have them. We always say, if you want a student to show you love upon graduation, you have to show them love while they're at the institution. There are 3 other items that we use to measure the extent to which students experience what we would call engaging learning experiences, applied learning experiences. So we have 3 items that we use to measure this. The first of which is the extent to which they worked on a long-term project that took a semester or more to complete. The second is whether or not they had an internship or job where they were able to apply what they were learning in the classroom. And the third is the extent to which they were extremely and deeply involved in extracurricular activities. And again, you see the percentage of college graduates nationally with a bachelor's degree or higher that report they had these experiences. I'd call attention in particular to the second of these items, which tends to be a favorite for many of our institutional partners, because of all the 6 items that we track that have these important relationships with long-term outcomes for graduates, this second one has the most important impact. We find that if a student had an internship or job where they were able to apply what they were learning in the classroom, they're twice as likely to have a good job upon graduation, not just a job, but a good job. They're also 3 times as likely to be thriving in their well-being and to be engaged at work upon graduation. So it's a hugely important experience, in part because students find out what they're not good at. And I often hear that from graduates. It was a good elimination strategy. And also sometimes because they find out what they're really good at and make an amazing connection with an employer that they can take with them upon graduation. We had another version of this question that we tested when we first launched the survey that just asked about having a job or internship. We found no sorting effect in having a job or internship with those long-term outcomes. It was really the application piece. If they were applying what they were learning in the classroom, that's where the outcome really took off for students. And you'll see here on the screen, just 6% of our graduates agree with all 3 of these statements. And unfortunately, just about 3% of all graduates nationally had all 6 of those experiences. So if you're thinking you're one of them, then you're the lucky few, unfortunately, of college graduates nationally. Now, we find really important relationships between these 6 items and other measures that we have in the survey, one of which is the extent to which you felt prepared well for life outside of college. That's an item that we've been tracking among college graduates nationally for some time. What you'll see here is the more experiences students had among these 6 that we measure, the more likely they are also to strongly agree that their institution prepared them well for life outside of college, which of course includes so much more than just your job. It includes your personal life, it includes your ability to manage your finances, your ability to network within your alumni base, a million things that are important for individuals to find really fulfilling careers and personal lives. I also want to mention this issue of engagement in particular. We find that students, the more likely they were to engage in these experiences and have these big six, the more likely they were to be engaged at their work upon graduation. And you'll hear us talk a lot about engagement at Gallup as opposed to just employment status, because we believe that yes, everyone goes to college to get a job, but they go to get a good job. They don't just go to get any job. And a good job for most people is actually a deeply fulfilling one. So it's not enough anymore that it's just a well-paying job. It has to be one for which people feel deeply fulfilled. And that's more true for the generations that are currently graduating from college than any generation before them. And we see that through our work at Gallup writ large. We've been measuring employee engagement for 40 plus years now here at Gallup. And what we see is a tremendous shift in how people think about their work. It's become a disproportionate amount of their time, and they have a huge expectation of it that is an incredibly fulfilling part of their time. So we see that particularly for newer graduates. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about why these items matter to you all. I know some of you are familiar with some of the other metrics that we also have in the surveys, but the reason I mentioned those six and kind of their impact on some of the important long-term and short-term outcomes that we've been tracking at Gallup is because we understand that those are items that are really important to how you all are conceptualizing a life transformative education and that you would like to use in a survey of your own students. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how our partnership is designed, and then I'd love to pause for any good questions that you all have, either about the historic research that we've conducted or our partnership together. So we've conceptualized our partnership to be this. We're going to be conducting a web-based survey with currently enrolled students at your institutions. And we're going to be asking them a series of questions that we identify in partnership with you all. So we obviously have a rich database that we're able to pull from with 100+ questions included in it, the 6 of which I just mentioned here today, as well as other really important questions. What we want to do there is just track the extent to which your students at your institution are actually experiencing those items and how they're performing on them. And that'll do a few things. I mean, one of which is that'll allow us to compare across the institutions that are participating and help understand what are some bright spots that we want to learn from across the participating institutions, but we'll also be able to compare each of the institutions that participates to a national baseline that we have at Gallup that will be really valuable. So you can understand not just how do you compare to one another, but how do you compare to the entire college student population. Now, when we're going to be phasing this in and doing this work at a time that is ideal for you all. So we're going to be working very closely with the team to identify when we should be surveying students. We're going to have 2 major survey periods for which participating institutions can select from. The idea there is that we might want to do a survey in the spring. Some institutions may want to wait for the fall. We want to do it at a time that's convenient for you all, while also keeping in mind for any participating institution what other surveys that they have going on at the institution at the same time. Survey fatigue is a real problem. It's a problem everywhere. We want to minimize it as much as possible and also make the data maximally, useful for you all. So if you have a specific program that's launching, we'll be cognizant of that. So we'll be working with you all to identify the ideal survey periods, but we'll be surveying the entire group of students that you share with Gallup, some of which might have experienced some of the programming that's been introduced to actually impact the extent to which a student achieves a life transformative education. Some students might not have yet participated. We can talk a little bit about the ideal sampling selection process at each individual institution. What we want to do is to provide a little bit of a baseline for your institution so you can continue to track progress moving forward. But as we talked with your team, we understand that everybody's on a little bit of a different journey, and actually that's great because we'll learn from each other. But importantly, we want to make sure that we're serving the right group of students at your institution and at the right time. So much more to come on that, but just wanted to call that out specifically that we'll be working with each of the institutions to really make sure that the project works for you all. Importantly, the final list of questions that we ask of all students will be used so that we can provide each participating institution a data set back to them. And we'll be working with each institution too to identify, are there any customizations you'd like to see to the survey? So we'll have some optionalizing as well. So if a school says, you know what, we'd really like to add these additional 5 questions, we can absolutely do so. We just work that out with the individual school that would like to make that change. And likewise, if the de-identified data set is insufficient, you need digital analysis and reporting, there will be some options to contract and work with Gallup directly on that as well. So I would love to pause there for anything that I missed, Tom and Rick and team, Keith, that we've talked about over the last few weeks that you feel like is important to cover, but also to answer any questions that anyone has. I'm going to stop sharing my screen just so I can see your faces a little bit big.
No, Stephanie, that was a terrific overview. Thank you. I think it's a perfect time to break for questions. So I'm sure there will be many.
Wonderful.
I think one of the questions, you said with the participating groups, there are 12 groups currently who are, receiving the Kern seed grants, and that those are the groups envisioned in this this first survey. But once the survey is developed, we hope that others will join in and adopt a sort of common assessment tool. Any questions? And I'm not in gallery mode. Hang on a second so I can see everybody.
And for those of you who are interested in just some of this research in general, I would also just point you to our website. We actually have a lot of the reports that we've released historically on news.gallup.com. So if you're ever interested in the research or the work that we've done, please feel free to also navigate to those reports.
Great. I see a hand up from Barry at Embry-Riddle. So,
yeah, thank you. A fairly quick question. With all that's happened in the last year and 2 years with COVID, how has that all worked into the survey questions? And because you're going to be asking about experiences and interactions with faculty and opportunities on school, at your school, et cetera. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, great question. So each of the years in which we fielded the National Alumni Survey, we've actually changed some of the questions that we ask on it. So we kind of have a core group of questions that we've kept pretty consistent. Then we have additional questions that we've added over time. As you can imagine, last year, we really wanted to add some particularly important questions to understand the challenges students were facing and connecting with faculty and staff, especially for those students who are remote or in a hybrid learning experience last year. So we have a lot of great questions too that are available for which we have baselining and benchmarks on. We also continue to test each year in which we have those questions about the Big Six on the survey. We continue to test the impact of those questions because obviously the very clear theory could be that some of these things become more or less important as other factors pop up on a campus or evolve. We find that the Big Six continue to have the same impact, but I will say there are other questions too that we've begun tracking more closely that we think are also incredibly important. A lot of questions on diversity, equity, inclusion specifically, about feeling as if you could report an issue and it would be taken seriously if you did so. Also some important questions about belongingness on campus that I would definitely recommend you consider including, especially because I think that'll continue to be important long after COVID. So we have some other questions too that are certainly some favorites that I'll highlight for you all as we dive in. But I'm really excited because I think the most fun part, this is because I'm a methodologist by training, is picking up the questions. And there's so many great questions that you could benefit from that we've tested nationally at other institutions, and they cover so many distinct constructs. I think right now the database is up to about 170 questions. So we have a lot to choose from in addition to the 6 that I think would be really relevant post-COVID and during COVID, which appears we're going to be in longer than I thought.
Thank you. Good question. John Boland first, and then Nicole.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie, and it's nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
I'm curious, and maybe I missed it. Is part of the survey, would it also go to alumni, or is it just students? One, and then we're doing a lot of assessment work as we roll out our CLTE projects, and one of the things that we have been doing, because we're going across 7 universities, is we are going to be using, well, we have been using NESI because there's a lot of embedded questions with NESI every year, and the NACM surveys of 5 and 10 years. So how would this differentiate, potentially from some of those? And again, the alumni question. Thanks.
Yeah, great question. So the first question, student versus alumni, we're only currently planning on interviewing students. Having said that, that could certainly evolve. So we should come back to that, especially if it makes more sense for specific institutions later on to be thinking about it from an alumni-based lens. But currently the plan is just focus on students. And then on the second question, in terms of NESI, we consider ourselves more complementary to NESI and less redundant, in part because we've really designed it to be so. We spent a lot of time in early days actually looking at the NESI instruments and working with individual institutions to understand what would be complementary. So you'll see some of the items are likeness in the concept or the construct they're covering, but they approach it from slightly different angles. So for example, Nessie might ask about the frequency in which you met with an academic advisor. We don't really ask those questions. We ask more so the extent to which you feel cared for as a person. So they tend to work actually in concert with one another. And depending upon the type of data that you're collecting within the institution and the permissions that you have to either use or share that data, you might even be able to merge the data sets for you and create some, more effective data sets. So that's always an option too that we can explore later.
Yeah, I'd love to explore that because of course, because of the way we're approaching it, Nessie and NACM both don't quite address what we want, and that if you can complement those, that'd be wonderful. Thanks.
That's great.
Thank you. Nicole?
Hi, thank you. I've appreciated this presentation, and I have seen Gallup present a few times over the years about the Gallup Purdue Index, and it's an impressive study. And I'm going to admit both that I am a methodologist myself, and it's been a minute since I have looked at those old reports. So I was wondering if you could refresh my memory about how you approach some of the constructs that are really important to us here at CLTE, like meaning, purpose, identity, and agency.
Yeah, great questions. We have a series of questions on those items. I mean, certainly our well-being items are ones that are a favorite, I would say, among our client partners on the issue of purpose specifically. So for those of you who are less familiar, Gallup has a well-being index that we use to measure the extent to which somebody is thriving, struggling, or suffering in one of 5 areas of their well-being. So purpose, which for those who are in the workforce looks a little bit more like career well-being. For those who are studying and as a student really look like the extent to which they're studying something they're interested in. We also have financial, social, community, and physical well-being. The idea there is that across those 5 domains, purpose, social, community, physical, and financial well-being, that really tells you how you're living your whole life. We have 2 items specifically on the issue of purpose that we really like, in part because they measure very nicely against other metrics that we've used in the past to validate those items. So for example, if you have high purpose well-being, you're more likely to stay at your job long-term. You also have lower levels of healthcare costs, absenteeism, turnover, et cetera. So there are a lot of other external outcomes that we've used to create the well-being index. We actually have a great meta-analysis that's publicly available if anyone likes to give it a read, that I always send folks that I think is really interesting on the purpose part. The other piece of the purpose puzzle is around our engagement, some of our items that we use to measure the extent to which you feel deeply fulfilled and engaged and emotionally connected to your work in your workplace. So those are some of my favorite items. We actually, when we first started the study with Purdue, we had some great faculty members who really informed some of our items around purpose that I can also send over to you, might find interesting. So we have a long battery of items, but those are my favorite on the issue of purpose in particular.
Yeah, let me weigh in on this just a little bit, because it's a really interesting question, and Rick alluded to it in his opening talk, that the identity, agency, and purpose were sort of an extraction, if you will, of that we as the executive group of CLTE extracted from the CLTE data. The raw data is the strong correlation between these certain big 6 questions and the outcomes that we were looking for in terms of long-term well-being and work engagement throughout life. And so what we decided to do, we could do all kinds of surveying, but we decided that if we believe that those correlations are more than coincidental, that we would go back to those questions as the starting point of what we're trying to achieve. And let me illustrate a little bit about how we extracted that connection. So there's Nicole, one of the questions was, and Stephanie did a really nice job of distinguishing this one. You know, I had the opportunity to apply what I'd learned while still a student to a job or internship. And we noticed what Stephanie said, which was, when you just asked, did you have a job or internship, there was no correlation. But when you had the opportunity to connect your curricular experience to something in the real world, then there was a really powerful correlation. We interpreted that as you were empowered by your knowledge, you made that connection, that we interpreted that as agency. And I want to say that because sometimes that history is lost, and it may, you know, for better or worse. In one of the breakout sessions, people were bringing up other ways in which students have agency, and they're really quite different, right? Somebody brought up, the development of networks as producing agency, and maybe it does, but it really, it's a different sort of agency than what we were extracting from the original data. So I think there's an advantage to going back to the original questions, because if you go to the extractions, then they lead to a lot, to so many more connections. I don't know what it means, but that's my opinion. Anyway, I think this is hard to discuss in a group of 40 some people, but a really important question, and one we can kind of chew on over time, because I think you've raised a really great point. I saw Linda had a question. And I think she's muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Now I can.
Okay. Stephanie, I'm curious about this wellness piece, and it's based on some research that I've read by this person named Prylatensky, and he was looking at, or basically found that that one cannot experience wellness without fairness. That essentially they have to have, well, two things. One, they have to have their what's due them as a human being, like safety and food and that sort of thing. But also they have to experience moving through the world in a way that is fair to them. That they're given these things or afforded these things or have access in a way that's fair in terms of its distribution. So in other words, a lot of these surveys, they kind of look at the person, but the system is invisible. And we know, based on our social identity, we really have different experiences as we move through the world, oftentimes. So I'm not sure what I'm asking, but does your survey in any way kind of get to those systemic issues that may kind of intersect with the DEI questions?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is where I love to dig down into some of the subgroups of the student population, because to your point, they're experiencing your culture so differently based on their own unique component in which they live at the institution. And we do see like very seismic differences between groups of the population that I think are really important. But it's absolutely true. Fairness and equity, and also just a belief that the institution would do the right thing if you did make a report. One of the most, I think, frustrating articles that I've ever written was about 2 years ago, where we reported that people were most at risk of sexual assault on campus were the least likely to believe that if they reported something, the university would take them seriously. That's a problem, right? So we have a lot of great findings like that. They're really disappointing, but I also think really underscore the need for systematic change at the institutional level on some of these topics. We do see some intersection on the issue of well-being based on experiences around marginalization of historically underrepresented groups. So it definitely comes out in the data. Sometimes it comes out in their own self-assessment. Sometimes it comes out in their assessment of the culture at the institution. So I think you'll see that come out in a few different items. One of my favorite items that we've asked historically has been the extent to which you were exposed to people from different backgrounds than you, and you had the ability to regularly interact with those people. If you strongly agree with that statement, you're more likely to believe your degree is worth the cost for all the obvious reasons that exposure is so important to how you conceptualize the value of your degree. So we have some great items around that too, just exposure to diversity that I think would be really valuable.
Yeah. Yeah. So if empowerment connects to creating agency and well-being, unempowerment obviously can impede that. So it's right. So you want to do the empowering and remove the unempowering influences. Okay, let's see. We're getting close to the end. In fact, we're at the end. I didn't realize the time flew so fast. I just looked. It's 4 o'clock. Stephanie, thank you again. That was a really terrific presentation. We're so excited to have your partnership and that of Gallup. Yeah, if you join me in unmuting for just a second, let's give Stephanie a round of applause and a thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you all so much for having me. And if I didn't get to one of your questions, please feel free to email it to me. I'd be happy to answer it offline as well.
Back to you, Keith.
Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Stephanie.